All right, welcome back to our church history class, and this is actually the final class of our semester. So we are looking at the church in the modern world, part 2. And of course, you probably will recall, if you've been following along, we did part 1 last week. Again, wrapping things up and looking at the kind of where we went from World War I, World War II, all the way up through the current pontificate of our Holy Father, Pope Francis. So a little bit of a review. Again, not starting all the way at the very beginning of our semester and going through everything, but highlights from the last several hundred years that kind of have gotten us to this point. We talked a lot about the scientific revolution and how a lot of that came out of our Catholic faith and from Catholicism. So many of the scientists and leaders of that era of discovery and really explosion of scientific research was being done by priests and other Catholics as well. And so, of course, out of the scientific revolution that we see, we really then began to see over the last a couple hundred years, about 200 years back, we see what we refer to as the Industrial Revolution, which I'm sure you've studied in your classes as well, in many different times and places. You've heard of that. Again, as out of the scientific revolution, we see this, of course, this explosion in technologies as well, and people begin to use that for profit, and it really kind of remakes all of civilization. It really remakes the entire world, because what we begin to have happen is there now is ways to structure society other than the farm system that really had been in place all over the world, in every country, in every community, which was basically people growing their own food for the vast part. You had trade, of course, taking place and things like that, but the vast majority of people, there was no really massive organization or structure going on, no huge cities, no real, machinery and that kind of thing. So we see that with the steam engine and lots of other things, this restructuring of society where now we have these massive factories, we have lots of other, industrial farming is now an option, and all of this stuff. So it refashions and remakes society. And so we see then, particularly with the beginning with Leo the 13th, Pope Leo the 13th, this Catholic social teaching emerging over the last 200 years, which is really the church saying this is how we should respond. This is, given this rise of new technology, given this industrial revolution explosion, this new ways of structuring our societies and our families and all of that kind of stuff, the church has been over the last 200 years really cranking out lots of different things, lots of Catholic social teaching about how we can respond to this. And so it's a really beautiful element of our Catholic faith, this Catholic social teaching. Really encourage you to read it, to study it. You can find, shorter summaries of it, but, there's a lot there, and just really encourage people to dive into that. We also see, then we talked last class, in how in the 1900s, we really see an explosion of non-Christian, what we might call secular, societies, and as a part of that, we see really an explosion as well in the sort of inhuman, on a massive scale, kind of persecution and attacks against peoples, against human dignity. And so we see, of course, the first great world war in 1917, where we see, again, lots of people killed, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people killed and put to death, really resulting not from, so many people want to blame religion, and looking back in history as we've done over the last 15 classes, people will say, look at all these wars that religion was causing and happened because of religion. Well, again, we see that actually when you drive religion out of societies, what happens is not less war, but actually a much more intense and inhumane and destruction on a completely different level. And so I think into the world that, yes, people live religion imperfectly, but religion still has, and particularly our Catholic faith, I think we can say, still has this great ability to, despite the imperfections and sins of people, it makes the world a better place, right? It makes things better. And when you drive that out, what we've seen in communism and in other places in the 1900s, what you see is that, in fact, it doesn't become a happier world, it doesn't become a better community, it doesn't become a better country, it becomes a more inhumane country. It becomes a persecution a lot of times in just a destructive and very violent place. And so our Catholic faith, I think we can see as we look back over these 2,000 years of our history, we see that it does actually bring so many things, and in fact really is the kind of the engine there at the core that drives healthy societies, imperfect societies. But again, there's a great effect that it has overall on countries and communities when it is lived well. So we also see in 1917 then as a final piece of review here, again, communism. So as World War I breaks out, we also see communism taking root in Russia. There's a revolution in Russia, and communism really becomes, for the first time in Russia, the law of the land. And again, it also professes at its very core getting rid of all faith, getting rid of God, driving God out of society, and the belief that there would be a perfect society or a society without all of its problems that would spring up. And of course, we see that the complete opposite happens. So now as we look at our current chapter, our final chapter, we're looking here first of all at 1939. And what happens that year is that Pius XII is elected, and also Germany invades Poland. Adolf Hitler really begins his campaign that was kind of done, this is the kickoff of World War II in a sense, because that's the first time, the first country that is invaded. Germany and Hitler and their tanks roll across the German border and into Poland for their first kind of military campaign that would really essentially kick off World War II. As we see this connection between Pius XII, the church and Pius XII are always, a lot of times in the larger world, you're probably not hearing this criticism in high school, but maybe when you get to college or as an adult, you will hear people criticizing and saying, why didn't Pope Pius XII do more to stop Nazi Germany? Why didn't he do more to talk about the dignity of the person? Why didn't he do more for the Jewish people? Why didn't he condemn Nazism? We talked about how there was a letter that was read at every pulpit in Germany condemning Nazi Germany. Once it kind of becomes apparent what Nazi Germany is really about. But also, I think it's important, again, to review one of the things that the second most killed group by the Nazis were Catholics, right? So after the Jews in the concentration camps, the number 2 group of people, if you will, a culture of people, were the Catholics that were put to death. Also, just kind of some other things to keep in mind. The church in 1939 has really only Vatican City as its territory, right? And so it's surrounded by the Italian government, which is, of course, is an ally of Nazi Germany. So, you have the axis of evil there with Italy and Germany and Japan. And so really, in a sense, the Vatican, all throughout World War II, is really surrounded by the Nazis and the Italian allies of the Nazis as well. So they're really in a tough position. The Vatican is essentially held hostage in the middle of enemy territory throughout most of World War II. The church did really a lot to protect and secretly shelter Jews throughout the city of Rome and the Vatican throughout the entirety of World War II. And just as proof of this, I would like to turn to 2 Jewish sources here. First of all, the chief rabbi of Jerusalem said in 1944, his name is Rabbi Isaac Herzog, he wrote to the Pope and said, "The people of Israel, the Jews, will never forget what His Holiness, Pope Pius XII, and his illustrious delegates as Catholics are doing for us unfortunate brothers and sisters in the most tragic hour of our history." So while people want to condemn the church and condemn Pius XII for not doing more, for not saying more, for not protecting more Jews or whatever it might be, the chief rabbi of the Jewish people in Jerusalem in 1944 writes a letter thanking the Pope and saying, "We will never be able to thank you enough for all of the amazing things that you and your church have been doing for us as Jewish people in the midst of this persecution." So it's crazy that, roughly 80 years later, we have all these people condemning the church when the people who are living it in the midst of it, of the Jewish people and their leaders, are thanking the church for what they did in the midst of difficult situations that the church and the Jewish people found themselves in. Also, I think very telling is that the chief rabbi of Rome at the time of World War II, his name is Rabbi Israel Zoli, he becomes Catholic. He converts to Catholicism based on what he had seen the Catholics doing for the Jewish people in the midst of World War II. I mean, that's like just a really powerful thing. I mean, anybody who's criticizing the church would say, well, the two chief rabbis, one of Jerusalem, thanks the Pope. The rabbi of Rome, based on what he saw, converts to Catholicism, right? So I think really this criticism of Pius XII and of Catholicism really is unfounded and is just, again, it's something that people use to kind of attack the church, but it's not really what we see when we look at the evidence of history. We also see at this time, about this time, kind of on the heels of World War II, as communism takes place in Russia, it takes root in Russia in 1917, we also see communism coming to China in the 1900s, particularly in 1949, led by Chairman Mao. And he ruled from 1949 to 1976, so about 30 years. Chairman Mao led China in the midst of this communist revolution. What's crazy about this is that it's estimated that he oversaw the death of 40 to 70 million people, right? I grew up Catholic. I never heard that. You know, I went to took history classes in college, took history classes in high school, never really heard anything about this. And yet this Chairman Mao in this communist China, under his reign, he has the highest body count of any government in the history of the world, right? Between 40 and 70 million. That's no government. The Nazis are credited with only killing about 6 million people. Compared to that, 40 to 70 million, it's just a mind-blowing number, right? The Chinese really cracked down. The Chinese communists really cracked down and tried to drive out the church, try to drive out Christianity and other faiths, because again, it's at the heart of communism to get rid of all religion. China, in an attempt even as well to attack the church and to separate the Chinese even further from their faith, they set up their own Catholic church, and they call it the Chinese Catholic Patriotic Association. Right? So the Chinese Communist government tries to create a public government Catholic church, right? In order to just kind of maybe further confuse people and all this. I mean, it's crazy to do that. Imagine America creating its own Catholic church, separate from the Pope and all this other stuff, and trying to create a government-run Catholic church. It's just really, it's really hard to fathom. The Catholics who in China then, because creating this sort of above-ground Catholic church, this public government-run Catholic church in quotes, right? The Catholics in China have basically from that time kind of gone underground or secret, and so there's these, the secret church that's having to kind of exist underneath the, out of the public limelight and in secret as has happened in so many other places throughout the 2,000-year history of the church, where the Catholic Church is driven, as we say, underground and having to have masses in secret, and people are being put to death if you get caught, all that kind of stuff. So communism in China and Russia, as it's practiced, was just deadly and destructive to lots of people, and particularly to Christians and to the Catholic Church. Another big element here over the last part of our chapter, as we start to get nearer to our own times, of course, we need to spend some time looking at the Second Vatican Council, which took place in the 1960s. So as we're thinking about Pius XII, who was the Pope throughout most of the Second World War, he dies in 1958, and Cardinal Angelo Roncalli is elected Pope, and he takes the name Pope John XXIII. Okay? And so he has this question that he's wrestling with basically from the moment that he takes over in 1958, which is, how should the church kind of engage with the modern world as we see all these changes taking place and new communication and the world really kind of becoming more united, more one, as these technologies just continue to explode and we have the increase in all these different ways of communication and stuff really are starting to be seen. And so this question, as humanity begins to kind of be united and connected more and more, how does the church engage that? And so Pope John XXIII convenes the Second Vatican Council and says, let's have a council. Let's get all the bishops and cardinals and everybody, all the leaders of the church and theologians together to say, what can we be doing as a church in this modern world to continue to bring the gospel to people? Pope John XXIII dies 8 months months into the council. The council begins in 1962, so he dies 8 months in, and Pope Paul VI is elected to kind of, and then so Pope Paul VI really kind of carries the flag of the council and continues to lead the church. The council lasts for 3 years, but really it continues to be, documents and meetings continue to kind of happen as a fruit of the council for at least another 5 years or so. So there are 4 pillar documents. The council cranked out a ton of documents over the course of those 3 years, and then the 5 or so years following as well. But the 4 major documents are on 4 different topics. One of them is on Scripture, and it is called, the church documents are always titled by the first 2 Latin words of the document. So on Scripture, the first pillar document is about the Bible and on sacred Scripture. Its Latin title is Dei Verbum, which means the Word of God. And then we have a second document on the liturgy, or the Mass, of course. And that word, that title in Latin is Sacrosanctum, okay, Concilium. And so Concilium means council, Sacrosanctum means sacred. So the Sacred Council, referring to the Second Vatican Council. So the document on the liturgy is called Sacrosanctum Concilium. The third pillar of the 4 pillar documents is on engaging the modern world, of course, which we were talking about, which is called Gaudium et Spes. So Gaudium and hope. So Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope, is on how the church should approach and engage the modern world. And then finally, a document reflecting on what the church is, how the church understands itself, how the church continues to think of itself. And so that document in Latin is called Lumen Gentium, so light to the nations, or light to the peoples, which is, of course, one of the ways to think about the church. So the 4 documents, again, the Latin titles, Dei Verbum, Sacrosanctum Concilium, Gaudium et Spes, and Lumen Gentium. Okay? The Second Vatican Council in the United States, I think we need to talk a little bit about that, because it's important to know, and really throughout the world, but as we turn it to our own experience here in the United States for just a moment, councils always take a while to actually fully be implemented, right? To have their effects kind of spread and reverberate and echo, and the changes that they might call for and so forth. Most historians say that all of the ecumenical councils, all of the councils of the church, going back all the way to Nicaea, Jerusalem, all those early ones that we've talked about throughout the last 15 chapters, all of them have taken about 90 to 100 years to fully kind of be realized, for have the dust settle for them, so to speak. Just one example is, the Council of Nicaea in 325 that we talked about early on, which was really a council to deal with the Arian crisis, the Arian heresy that had spread through the teachings of Arius, right? Really 50, 60, 70 years after Nicaea, when they had squashed Arianism, Arianism actually continued to grow around the world, and it really took about 90 to 100 years before Arianism was kind of completely eradicated. So we see that happening. And so the Second Vatican Council, we're only, about 60 years since the Second Vatican Council ended. And so we're still kind of trying to figure out and wrestle with what changes did the church call for, how do we implement them faithfully, and that kind of thing. And unfortunately in the United States and lots of other places too, there are many things that right after the council happens, many things that were done, whether it's to the Mass or to other things about church teaching, people were just saying and being done in the spirit of Vatican II, although they were things that the church didn't actually teach at Vatican II. Right? So just in the Mass, for example, things about like getting rid of the communion rail. A lot of people just went in and ripped them out. So the communion rails, places where people could kneel and receive communion. People went in and ripped them out. The church never said anything at all about getting rid of communion rails at the Second Vatican Council, right? The church never said anything about having Mass facing the people at the Second Vatican Council. And yet many people said that that's what the Second Vatican Council taught, that the priest needs to turn around. The Mass, according to the Council, the document on the Mass, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the church, the Mass was supposed to retain most of its Latin, and really only certain things were allowed as exceptions to be done in the native language, but that every Catholic should still know every piece of the Mass in Latin. Well, that was basically ignored and not listened to either. And a lot of this was able to happen because although communication was really ramping up, there still wasn't the internet. There still wasn't this really quick, fast way to get these documents to people. Most people, of course, too, just kind of listened to and believed their priests or the theologians. And so when people just showed up and said, hey, this is what the church said, everyone just kind of believed that. And so in many things, with the Mass and church teachings as well, this kind of just happens, even though the council doesn't teach it. Another issue that's still really a hot-button issue in the United States and around the world was also with the Second Vatican Council, kind of on the heels again in that post-council period, as it was continuing to wrestle with and talk about and debate what does the church teach on contraception. So in 1969, Pope Paul VI releases a letter. So it's still kind of considered part of Vatican II, even though it's, again, in this post-period of Vatican II. But anyways, Pope Paul VI issues this letter, Humanae Vitae, which condemns contraception in every form, chemical contraception as well. And so that really, again, people were already saying for 2 years prior to Pope Paul VI's letter, oh, the church is going to, get rid of contraception, or say that, it's okay for Catholics to use contraception in certain instances and that kind of stuff. And then Paul VI says, no, that's not true, and releases this letter. And so this is really, there's a lot of people that are still kind of working out of that, a place maybe of anger or confusion about what the church says. It's estimated that currently maybe 80 to 90% of Catholics who are married use contraception still in their marriages, even though the church has taught that that's never to be allowed and that it's a serious sin to do that. So we have this stuff, we kind of see these things that are still playing out and they're still being wrestled with and worked through. So these are kind of the fruits as we see kind of where we're at with the council, of the Second Vatican Council, and kind of the controversies as we're still kind of trying to figure it out. But so many things of the council, I think also we can say very clearly, have borne a lot of great fruit and have been teachings that people have continued to go back to and looked at. But again, sadly, most of what people think about when they think about the council right now in the United States is still kind of the tensions that we're experiencing as we still try to wrestle with and figure out and look at what did the Second Vatican Council actually teach. I think Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, in a particular way, both were very good at trying to call us back to saying, go back. Both of those popes said very clearly many times, go and read the documents of the council itself. Don't listen to what other people tell you about the council. Don't listen to other people's kind of watering it down. Go and read the documents themselves. And I think what you see there is you see both the beauty of the teachings of the church and the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and you see that a lot of what people really make it all about is not what the Second Vatican Council was really tackling and taking on. And there's a lot of beautiful things there. And so I would say the same thing. I think that's a really important thing. If we're really going to figure out how to implement the council and what the council was saying and how we're going to move past these places of tension, I think it's really important that we go back and read some of those documents, right? Find the big ones, the major ones, and read them and listen to what they're saying. And I think in that, we might be able to actually move forward and also really draw the good fruit from the council, that there's so much good stuff there. We just have to go and look at it and read it. Okay, so moving then on to our final couple of popes. And so Pope Paul VI, who kind of carries the flag of the Second Vatican Council and, from 1963 on there, he dies in 1978, about 15 years later. And the cardinals elect Cardinal Albino Luciani as Pope on August 26, 1978, to replace Paul VI. He takes the name Pope John Paul I, but he dies only 1 month later, September 28, 1978. So he was a pope for only 1 month. The cardinals get back together and elect Cardinal Karol Wojtyła on October 16, 1978, and he takes the name Pope John Paul II. He's the first pope to be elected outside of Italy for hundreds of years, and of course comes to us from Poland, a very Catholic country. And so 1978 is sometimes referred to as the year of 3 popes, because we had Pope Paul VI, who dies in 1978. John Paul I is elected, but dies a month later. And then John Paul II is also then, of course, elected in 1978. So we can imagine what that might be like to live through the death of two popes in the same year and the election of two popes. So certainly probably a very interesting time for people and for Catholics in 1978 there. But of course, again, we see this John Paul II is really kind of who comes out of this 1978 and would be our Pope for decades, right? And really kind of brings a lot of unique gifts and talents to the papacy, as any Pope does. He is a great teacher of the faith and a brilliant theologian, recognized as a theologian and a philosopher even. He got his doctorate in philosophy and was a professor at a Catholic university in Poland for several years. And he develops these relationships with young people and gets to know them in this sort of college ministry setting. And as Pope, he also is known for he's known for his theology and philosophy and his teaching and his brilliant mind, but also a man who traveled hundreds of millions of miles, traveling all over the world. He kind of realized that the church needs to go out, and the Pope, as the leader of the church, kind of representative, needs to go out and visit people and bring the gospel to them. He's also known for completing the Catechism of the Catholic Church. He kind of says we need, out of the Second Vatican Council, we need to put together a catechism that kind of collects and puts together our teachings out of the Second Vatican Council and present it to the modern world. And again, as I said, he has a special love for young people, and he establishes the World Youth Day meetings of the youth. And so most people, when he initially pitches his idea, are afraid that no one will come, or that hardly anybody will come. And of course, millions of people attend the World Youth Day meetings. Our parishes have been blessed to go a couple of years ago as well. And so it's just, John Paul II, I think, will be remembered for those things in a particular way as we remember his papacy. Pope Benedict XVI, who is Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, he is elected Pope on April 19th, 2005, after the death of John Paul II. And like John Paul II, Benedict XVI is a brilliant theologian. He's written over 100 books throughout his priesthood, and just a really a very clear and very beautiful writer. He had a huge impact. Both of those priests had a huge impact on me as a Catholic growing up. John Paul II kind of helping me realize that I could be proud of my Catholic faith and that it was smart and beautiful. And also Benedict XVI, I really read a lot of his stuff. Fell in love with him as a seminarian because that was about the time that I entered the seminary when he becomes Pope. So I've been blessed to be able to read. I just love his writing and have read a lot of his books that he's written, and they've had a huge impact on me as a priest as well, as has Pope Francis, which I'll talk about in a minute. But anyways, I think both popes, both John Paul II and Benedict XVI, will probably be named doctors of the church one day. I think there are currently 35 doctors of the church, saints who have been just known for being great teachers of the faith throughout the 2,000-year history. So there's not a lot who receive that honor and that distinction of being doctors of the church, but I'm pretty sure that Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict will both be receiving that honor because of how helpful and how brilliant and how beautifully they've taught the faith through their papacies. Benedict XVI, of course, spends a lot of his papacy also trying to deal with and confront the sexual abuse crisis in the church, which really kind of breaks in 2002, first in the United States and then Boston, where the story kind of is uncovered and reported. It then kind of breaks across the United States, and stories start to emerge from all over the world, really, about the ways in which priests were shuffled around and moved, and the abuse a lot of times hidden or covered up. Sadly, I think a lot of times it was the priests were moved around and stuff either because there wasn't, at the time, maybe initially there wasn't a really good psychological understanding that we have now about that, hey, when somebody's doing that, you just have to, they can't be around, that you have to get them treatment and help right away. You don't just move them around. Also, I think a lot of times, sadly, it was done, the priests were moved around and nothing was said publicly about it because there was a fear that, gosh, if we say things publicly, people will leave the church, right? People will be scandalized. The sad thing is, of course, I think now that we realize, as we're looking back at it now, how people are way more scandalized when it's hidden, right? When it's not talked about. And so we're still dealing with that. Obviously, you and I are very aware of that. We're still dealing with that. Stories continue to come out, even, of course, in this year of 2018. We have stories coming forth about all of this as well, with cardinals and bishops being involved in the United States. And so it continues to be a huge scourge in our church. We're continuing to try to deal with it, to confront it, to put better things in place, better practices. But again, this is something that Pope Benedict had to really deal with, and it was part of his entire papacy as well. He resigns from the papacy in 2013 on February 11th. He announces that. Because of he felt like his age and his health had deteriorated to the point where he really just could not carry on the ministry, the day-to-day tasks that are needed. And so he was the first pope to resign in about 500 years. So it's happened before, but again, still obviously, if you are following the news and were aware back in 2013, you would know and remember that was obviously quite a shock and a surprise to people. But Pope Francis, of course, is elected the Pope. He was Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio from Argentina, and he was elected Pope on March 13th of 2013. And he takes the name, of course, Pope Francis I in honor of Francis of Assisi. And he's the first Pope from the Western Hemisphere, right? He hailing obviously from South America. I think as we think about Pope Francis's papacy so far, he will probably be remembered for his visible efforts to reach out to the poor and the marginalized, and his encouraging all Catholics to do the same thing. Right? Pope Francis has really been a champion of the poor, which has obviously been a great thing, and has also had a huge impact on my priesthood, as well as I'm sure hopefully for all of you as well, that call to go to the margins, to go to those who are less fortunate, to seek them out, and all of the ways in which he's visibly kind of shown us how to do that and led the way is really kind of, I think, have been a cornerstone and a major part of Pope Francis's papacy. So, as we bring this semester to a conclusion, a couple of questions to answer about this final chapter. First of all, what was the year of the three popes? What was the year of the three popes? Number two, who were the popes in the year of the three popes? Okay. Number three, who led the communist takeover of China and killed an estimated 40 to 70 million people during his reign? Number four, why did Pope John the 23rd call for the Second Vatican Council? And then number five, what were the Latin titles of the four pillar documents of the Second Vatican Council? Okay, so those are all of our questions for today. I hope and pray that you have a great week and a wonderful week as well, right? And just know that, again, praying for you. Look forward to our next semester of classes as well. Please always, as always, let me know if there's anything that I can do for you, and continue to live out your faith in daily prayer and going to church and going to Mass. And know my prayers for you always. God bless.